Everyone loves Spartans. The discipline, the abs, the one-liners. But here's what nobody mentions. Sparta was a slave state. Their entire warrior culture was built on the backs of enslaved Greeks called helots, who outnumbered them by a massive margin. So today, we're covering every type of military unit throughout history, starting with the most overrated tough guys of the ancient world. Spartan warriors. Spartan mothers handed their sons a shield before battle with one phrase: with this or upon this, come back victorious or come back dead. Ditching your shield to run was the ultimate disgrace. Boys were ripped from their mothers at age 7 and thrown into military barracks. No exceptions, and it worked. At Thermopylae in 480 BCE, roughly 300 Spartans held off a Persian force estimated between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers for 3 full days. Sparta was so confident in its warriors that the city had 0 defensive walls for nearly 900 years. Their official position: the men are the walls. But all that toughness was propped up by one thing nobody wants to glorify: the helots, enslaved Greeks who did all the actual labor while Spartans trained. But if you think Spartans were intense, wait until you meet warriors who fought in a literal trance state. Viking berserkers. Everyone pictures berserkers as mindless rage machines foaming at the mouth. The reality is somehow more terrifying. These were skilled, disciplined fighters who could flip a switch and enter a trance-like combat state where they reportedly felt 0 pain. The name likely comes from bear shirt, meaning they either wore bear skins into battle or fought bare-chested. Both options are deeply unsettling. Here's the thing: they weren't some organized military corps. They were elite retainers serving specific nobles. Basically a VIP bodyguard unit that had completely lost the plot. Now, our primary sources are Norse sagas written 200 years after the fact, so take the supernatural elements with a generous handful of salt. But whether it was ritual conditioning, psychology, or ingested substances, something turned these men into weapons. But if berserkers sound intense, wait until you hear about an army that literally could not die: the Persian Immortals. You know them from 300 as faceless masked monsters. Cool movie. Completely wrong. The real Immortals were 10,000 elite soldiers who served as the personal bodyguard of the Persian king. And here's the terrifying part: that number never changed. The moment one soldier fell in battle, a replacement was immediately promoted to fill the slot. You could watch them die all day, and the army never got smaller. It wasn't magic, it was logistics. But imagine being on the other side of that battlefield, killing soldier after soldier, and the enemy force looks exactly the same size it did an hour ago. But even the Immortals look disorganized compared to what Rome built next. Roman legionaries. Here's the thing about Roman legionaries: they weren't born warriors. Most of them were Italian peasants who got recruited, handed a sword, and turned into the most effective fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. Not through talent, through system. The standard expectation was simple: march roughly 30 kilometers in 5 hours carrying 60 pounds of gear, then be ready to fight. That was a normal Tuesday, and you signed up for 25 years of it with a land grant waiting at the end. Rome basically invented the military employment contract. At peak strength, a single legion fielded 5,500 men split into centuries under centurions, the real backbone of the entire operation. One-on-one, a legionary probably wasn't a better fighter than the barbarians across the field, but the machine was better, and the machine won for nearly 500 years across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. But if you think discipline alone makes a warrior, wait until you meet a class that turned combat into an entire philosophy of life. Samurai. Samurai are probably the most romanticized warrior class in history, and honestly, most of what you think you know about them is retroactive mythology. The ancient code of Bushido that supposedly guided them for centuries. It was largely written down in the 17th and 18th centuries, hundreds of years after the samurai class already existed. They basically wrote the rulebook after the game was already over. But here's what is real. At their peak during the Sengoku Civil War period, samurai made up roughly 5 to 10% of Japan's entire population. 1 in 10 people you'd meet was a professional warrior. And seppuku, ritual self-disembowelment, was a formal, codified response to defeat or dishonor. Death wasn't a risk of the job, it was in the job description. They lasted about 800 years. And how did it end? The Satsuma Rebellion in 1877. Samurai with swords charging conscript soldiers armed with rifles. 800 years of dominance collapsed in a single campaign against modern weaponry. Tradition met modernity, and modernity didn't even flinch. But if you think swords losing to rifles is a brutal power shift, wait until you hear about the cavalry force that conquered more land than any military in human history. The Mongol Heavy Cavalry. Everyone thinks the Mongols were just guys on horses who got lucky. They weren't. They were the most tactically advanced military force of the medieval world. And it's not even close. Genghis Khan's cavalry conquered 13.5 million square kilometers, the largest contiguous land empire in history. Their horses could travel 80+ kilometers a day on almost no feed. Their mounted archers could shoot accurately at full gallop with composite bows, effective past 200 meters. That is not a normal human skill. But here's the thing. The terror wasn't a side effect. It was the strategy. Calculated massacres weren't rage. They were policy. Wipe out one city completely, and the next 3 surrender without a fight. That's not barbaric. That's efficient. And if you think heavy cavalry peaked with the Mongols, wait until you meet the religious order that turned armored horsemen into a literal crusade. Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Then they spent the next 2 centuries building a territorial empire across Prussia and the Baltic. That's a creative interpretation of poverty. Founded during the Crusades in 1190, the order eventually controlled an entire region with around 3,000 to 4,000 active knights, operating what was essentially a military state. The crusading ideal was the branding. The actual business was colonial land grabbing and economic expansion. Wrapped in a white mantle with a black cross, it all came crashing down at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410. When a Polish-Lithuanian coalition destroyed them as a major power in a single afternoon. They never recovered. A ceremonial version of the order still exists today, headquartered in Vienna, which is the most politely reduced legacy of any medieval military power. But if you think using religion as cover for empire building is uniquely European, wait until you hear how the Ottomans built their elite army. Janissaries. The Janissaries have one of the wildest arcs in military history. They started as kidnapped children and ended as kingmakers who could topple empires. Here's how it worked. The Ottoman Empire ran something called the Devshirme system. Christian boys, aged 8 to 15, were taken from conquered Balkan families, converted to Islam, and trained as elite soldiers or administrators. They were forbidden from marrying, forbidden from having civilian jobs. Their entire existence was the core, and it worked. By the late 1500s, roughly 13,000 Janissaries served as the Sultan's personal guard and the Ottoman Empire's most feared infantry. That number ballooned to nearly 40,000 by the early 1600s. But here's where it gets complicated. These child soldiers grew up, accumulated power, and started deposing sultans they didn't like. The bodyguard became the boss. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II decided enough was enough. He orchestrated what historians call the Auspicious Incident, which is the most diplomatic name ever given to a state-organized massacre of approximately 6,000 Janissaries. 460 years of history ended in a single day. But if you think the Janissaries had a monopoly on punching above their weight, wait until you hear about the mercenaries that entire nations refused to fight. Swiss pikemen. Swiss pikemen didn't just win battles, they won contracts. For roughly 200 years, these mercenaries dominated European warfare with a brutally simple concept: a wall of 16-foot pikes that nothing could get through. And their reputation got so fearsome that armies would pay premium rates just to have them on their side because the alternative was fighting them. Here's the thing. A densely packed formation of pikemen could stop a cavalry charge cold. In an era where mounted knights were the ultimate weapon, that was genuinely revolutionary. Nobody had an answer for it, but technology always wins eventually. At the Battle of Marignano in 1515, French cavalry combined with artillery shattered the pike formation. It didn't matter how disciplined you were when cannonballs were tearing holes in your ranks. The Swiss didn't get replaced by better soldiers. They got replaced by gunpowder. And that pattern of technological obsolescence ending a dominant military era, get used to it. But if the Swiss pikemen built their legacy on reputation, the next unit built theirs on something even more powerful: undying loyalty to one man, Napoleon's Imperial Guard. To even qualify for Napoleon's Imperial Guard, you needed to be at least 5 feet 5, literate, have 5 years of military service, and multiple campaigns under your belt. In the early 1800s, that filtered for genuinely exceptional soldiers. But here's the thing, Napoleon almost never used them. Holding the guard in reserve was a deliberate psychological strategy. Their mere presence on the battlefield signaled to regular troops that Napoleon was confident that everything was under control. The Guard's power came from not deploying them, and that's exactly what destroyed him. At Waterloo on June 18, 1815, Napoleon waited too long. When he finally committed the Guard, they were repulsed, and the moment French soldiers watched the invincible Imperial Guard retreat, the entire army collapsed. Not because they were outfought, because the one unit that was never supposed to break, broke. The psychological pillar holding everything together vanished in an instant, but if the Imperial Guard earned their reputation by standing still, the next unit earned theirs by being absolutely terrifying in motion. The Gurkhas. Here's a military arrangement that has zero parallel anywhere on Earth. Since 1815, Nepal has supplied elite soldiers to the British Army, not as allies, not as a joint operation, as contracted foreign soldiers serving under a foreign flag, recruited primarily from Nepal's Gurung and Magar communities, through one of the most physically demanding selection processes in any military. Their iconic weapon is the kukri, a heavy curved blade that doubles as a tool and a close combat nightmare. And their reputation in hand-to-hand fighting hasn't faded in over 200 years of British Army records. After Indian independence in 1947, most colonial military arrangements ended, but the Gurkha pipeline didn't. Nepal kept sending soldiers, Britain kept taking them. That arrangement continues today, with roughly 3,500 Gurkhas serving across deployments in the Falklands, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But here's where it gets complicated. For decades, Gurkhas received lower pay than their British counterparts. Lower pensions, too. The same soldiers celebrated as legends of loyalty had to fight a public campaign just to get equal retirement benefits. Legendary loyalty sounds noble until you realize it was also conveniently cheap. And if you think a foreign nation lending its soldiers is unusual, wait until you hear about a military unit that lets you erase your entire identity at the door. The French Foreign Legion. The French Foreign Legion has been accepting criminals, deserters, and men with absolutely zero interest in explaining their past since 1831. And that's not a rumor. That was the actual policy. Show up, pick a fake French name, and your old identity is legally protected. Nobody asks questions. Nobody runs a background check. You just become someone else. Today, the Legion fields around 7,500 soldiers from over 140 countries, and the training is exactly as brutal as you'd expect. Recruits complete a grueling 60-kilometer march in full gear over 2 days, just to earn the right to wear the iconic white kepi. From colonial wars in Algeria and Indochina to modern operations in Mali and Central Africa, wherever France needs expendable force projection, the Legion shows up. But here's the kicker. In 1961, the Legion's own 1st Foreign Parachute Regiment tried to overthrow the French government. They participated in a full coup attempt against the state they served. The regiment was dissolved entirely. Having attempted military coup on your unit's permanent record is genuinely hard to top. But if you think rogue paratroopers are wild, wait until you hear about the Soviet pilots who terrorized the German army with wooden biplanes and zero fear. Soviet Night Witches. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment was an entirely female unit. Pilots, navigators, all of them women. And they flew combat missions from 1942 to 1945 in Polikarpov, A-2 biplanes, training aircraft from the 1920s with a top speed slower than the stall speed of German fighters. Here's the thing. That slowness was actually their greatest weapon. They were nearly impossible to track on radar, and they could make precision low-altitude bombing runs that faster aircraft physically couldn't replicate. They'd cut their engines and glide in silently, drop 2 small bombs, then do it again. 10 to 12 sorties per night. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches, because the sound of those engines cutting out before a bombing run sounded like a broomstick sweeping through the dark. Germany offered special awards for shooting one down. Few ever collected. Around 261 women served in the regiment over its lifetime. Roughly 30 died in combat. The unit earned 23 Hero of the Soviet Union titles, the highest decoration available, flying equipment that male pilots had discarded as obsolete years earlier. But speaking of units whose reputation preceded them, the next one earned theirs for very different reasons. Nazi Waffen-SS. The Waffen-SS grew from roughly 3,000 members in 1933 to nearly 900,000 by 1945, spread across approximately 40 divisions, and they were directly responsible for the deaths of at least 1 million civilians in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. That's not a side note. That's the point. The Waffen-SS wasn't a combat unit that also committed war crimes. It was a terror apparatus that also fought. Here's the thing. After the war, former SS veterans and sympathetic authors built a mythology around elite combat effectiveness, and it stuck. But historical analysis tells a different story. They suffered higher casualty rates than regular Wehrmacht units and achieved 0 decisive victories that meaningfully altered the war's trajectory. Stalingrad, Kursk, the Ardennes, they fought hard at all of them and lost all of them in strategic terms. Their defeat wasn't some unique tactical failure. Germany ran out of men, fuel, ammunition, and time. Allied industrial superiority and combined arms doctrine crushed the entire German war machine, SS included. But if you think fanaticism is always a weakness, the next unit turned it into something completely different. U.S. Marine Raiders. Here's a unit so famous it made this list despite existing for less time than most military enlistments. The Marine Raiders were established in 1942 as elite commando battalions modeled on the British Commandos, fielding around 800 to 1,000 men per battalion. They operated across the Pacific, including the Solomon Islands and New Georgia. Their brutal stand at Edson's Ridge cost the 1st Battalion devastating casualties in some of the most savage close quarters fighting of the entire Pacific theater. But here's the thing. They were dissolved in 1944. After just 2 years. Not because they failed, but because the military decided large-scale amphibious operations needed standardized infantry, not specialized commandos. There was also a quieter reason. The Marine Corps didn't love the implication that having an elite unit meant regular Marines weren't elite enough. Their legacy is genuinely mixed. Some call them the forerunners of modern special operations. Others say they were correctly retired when the strategy changed. Both sides have a point, but if you want to talk about a special operations unit that stuck around and defined the entire concept, we need to talk about the British SAS. British SAS. The SAS started as a desert raiding unit in North Africa in 1941, and it almost didn't survive past that. But it did, got reconstituted as a territorial army unit in 1947, then formally added to the regular army list in 1952, and now maintains roughly 400 active operators across 4 squadrons. Selection has a 90% failure rate over 6 months. That's not a recruiting slogan, that's the documented attrition. But here's what actually matters. In 1980, the Iranian embassy siege happened on live television. Millions of people watched SAS operators in black gear storm a building and rescue hostages in real time. That single event created the modern image of what special forces look like. Their real edge is decentralized command. Every operator is trained to make independent decisions when comms go down, because comms always go down. That philosophy directly shaped how Delta Force was built. The public myth around the SAS is bigger than their actual record, which includes real failures alongside the wins. But the doctrine they pioneered changed special operations forever. And speaking of rewriting the rules of warfare, the next group did it with almost nothing. Viet Cong guerrillas. The Viet Cong didn't need to win. They just needed to make America lose. At peak strength, Roughly 200,000 to 250,000 fighters blended directly into the civilian population, making them nearly impossible to identify, let alone eliminate. The Kyu-Chi tunnels alone stretched over 250 kilometers, housing supply lines, field hospitals, and staging areas completely invisible from the air. Then came the Tet Offensive in January 1968. The Viet Cong lost approximately 50,000 soldiers in coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. Militarily, it was a catastrophe, but the images of enemy fighters inside the U.S. Embassy compound destroyed American public confidence overnight. They lost the battle and won the war. After 1968, the Viet Cong effectively ceased to exist as an independent force, replaced almost entirely by North Vietnamese regulars. But the strategic lesson was already written. You don't have to beat the strongest military on Earth, you just have to make the war politically unwinnable at home. And speaking of military forces that built their entire identity on being unbeatable, let's talk about the most famous special operations unit in the world, Navy SEALs. Navy SEALs are probably the most famous special operations unit on the planet, and that's exactly the problem. Officially established in 1962, there are only about 2,500 active SEALs across 8 teams. Training includes Hell Week, 5 straight days of continuous sleep deprivation and physical stress, and roughly 75% of candidates fail. But let's talk about the mission that made them legends. Operation Neptune, Spear, May 2nd, 2011, the Bin Laden Raid, the most famous special operations mission in American history. The media version made it look surgical. The actual version was closer to controlled chaos that worked. A helicopter crashed on site. Months of unglamorous intelligence preparation made the whole thing possible, not superhuman reflexes. Here's what nobody talks about. SEALs have suffered over 400 casualties since 9/11, continuous deployment for over 2 decades. But the mythology, built through books, films, and branding, skips right past that. They are genuinely elite, and the public perception is still substantially exaggerated. But if you think SEALs get mythologized, wait until you hear about a unit so secret the government barely admits it exists. Delta Force. Delta Force was built from the ground up as a copy. Colonel Charlie Beckwith spent time embedded with the British SAS in the 1960s, came back to the US, and spent over a decade arguing that America needed its own version. He finally got approval in 1977. The unit currently fields roughly 250 to 300 operators, and getting in requires surviving an 18 to 24 month selection pipeline with a 95% plus washout rate. The process isn't just physical. It's specifically designed to test whether you can still think clearly when your body and brain are completely destroyed from exhaustion, because that's what real operations actually demand. And the operational record proves why that matters. Operation Eagle Claw in 1980, the Iran hostage rescue attempt, failed catastrophically before Delta even reached the hostages. Then came Mogadishu, October 3rd, 1993. The Black Hawk Down mission technically succeeded in its immediate objective, capturing key targets, but 19 Americans died, including 2 Delta operators, and the political fallout pulled the US out of Somalia entirely, a tactical win that became a strategic disaster. Sound familiar? Here's the thing about Delta Force. Most of what the public knows comes from soldier memoirs, not official sources. The government barely acknowledges the unit exists, which means the documented record is inherently incomplete, and separating fact from mythology is nearly impossible. At least Delta keeps quiet about it. The next unit on this list operates in the shadows for very different reasons. Wagner Group. Wagner Group wasn't a military unit, it was a loophole. So officially established around 2014, Wagner recruited from former Russian military, international mercenaries, and explicitly prison inmates, offered pardons in exchange for combat service. At peak strength, an estimated 50,000 fighters operated under its banner across Syria, Ukraine, Libya, and multiple African nations. But the fighters weren't the point. The point was plausible deniability. By routing state military objectives through a private military company, Russia could wage wars on 4 continents while officially having nothing to do with any of them, and it worked until it didn't. The Bakhmut campaign in Ukraine became Wagner's defining operation and its graveyard. Over 9 months of grinding urban combat in 2022 and 2023, Wagner suffered an estimated 20,000 or more casualties, many of them convicts who'd been on the front lines for weeks. It was a cost that would have been politically impossible to absorb as official Russian military losses. That was the entire point. Then, Yevgeny Prigozhin, Wagner's financier, got too loud. In June 2023, he led a brief armed mutiny against Russian military leadership. 2 months later, his plane fell out of the sky under circumstances that no credible observer on Earth believes were accidental. By late 2023, Wagner had fragmented. The organization that spent a decade as Russia's deniable instrument of force projection effectively dissolved after its founder was killed, which is either a lesson about the limits of private military power or a reminder that working for the Kremlin comes with a very specific severance package. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.